Aloha mai kākou e nā pua o Hawaiʻi. Welcome to Midday Manaʻo, right? Another Friday Avakea spent with Mehana, and Manu is not here today, so we send our aloha to Manu. But in his place, I have two fabulous guests that is joining us on Midday Manaʻo. Of course, this show is sponsored by the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement and the Kaiser Permanente Community Benefit Fund. Yeah? Aloha mai kākou. So today, everybody, we're going to talk about a subject that we'll all be celebrating, right? Today's Friday, come Monday, right? Most of us, not everybody, actually, but most people will have a day off, and it's in celebration of labor. Now, many of you are going to be today years old when you realize what labor in Hawaii, what labor movements here in Hawaii are all about, right? And to join me, I have my two fabulous friends who I've known for years, decades even. Telling how old we are.
Don't tell anyone.
Old. Yeah, we're not that old.
It's a huge
actually,
secret.
Just years. Yeah, because they look way younger. I don't know how they did it, but I'm not faring too well on this end. But anyway, let's just jump kind of right into it, right? So, Labor Day happening on Monday, right? What ʻIlima? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. So rude of me. See, I have the tendency to think that when I'm talking to one of my friends, that everybody knows who they are, of course. But today joining me is ʻIlima Long and Ikaika Hussey, right? And both of them are well known in the Hawaiian community for doing a whole variety of work over the years, from advocacy to protecting our cultural spaces, to being cultural practitioners themselves, and also being awesome mommies and daddies, right? And raising Hawaiian families in this very complicated time that we live in. Yeah. So now that I've done my duty as the host to introduce them properly, yeah, let's just jump right into it, right? So Monday, Labor Day is coming up, right? We have a history of labor here in Hawaii that some people may only know glimpses of. They might have heard of the plantations, they might have heard of other movements, but ʻIlima, can you help us kind of understand the history of the labor movement here in Hawaii, and also what Native Hawaiians' role was in that labor history?
Yeah, no, I would love to. This is actually the topic of my PhD research, so I've been able to dive into it a lot the last couple of years. But there are some things that we know just from if you've been through Hawaiian studies or, even just kind of general history classes in public schools here. We know about a little bit about labor history here. But the majority of it is centered around plantations and Asian labor. So I'm going to take us back a little bit to some of the things that we've heard about, but go a little bit deeper. So we know that the first plantation laborers even wore kanaka. And the first strike in Hawaii was the 1840 Koloa Kauaʻi sugar strike. And at that time, it was all Hawaiian laborers. But we never asked the question, how did they know how to do that? Like, how did they know how to strike? It wasn't a thing. It wasn't a big thing yet.
Because there was no
unions. That comes like a century later.
Right,
yeah.
There's no unions at that time.
There's no unions at that time.
Right. No
but there's some sort of
kind of
organizing happening.
Right.
So I wonder, does this come from our traditions? We've heard of Makai Nana being able to overthrow oppressive chiefs or bad chiefs. Maybe there was an in-between space where they knew how to disrupt things before it got to the overthrow level. Or was it through their interactions with other people? We had Kanaka whalers. This is a huge industry. This is probably the first huge sort of capitalist labor force, that and sandalwood. And Hina Keala from Molokai is doing her master's research all on Kanaka whalers, actually, right now. So that's exciting.
Shout out to Hina.
Yeah,
Aloha
shout out to
tita.
Hina. And so there's a lot of movement across the world happening by Kanaka who are workers. And so maybe that information is coming back to the plantations.
What year was
that
this
way.
about, you said?
1840 is the first strike.
And so by 1840, we see the first semblances of the newspapers, right? Like at least there's literacy happening coming from across, you know, the ocean, and Native Hawaiians just kind of really jumping right into it, right? That could be possibly a source. There's communication happening.
Yeah, there's lots of travel, lots of literacy at this point. And even actually, the Koloa sugar strike is narrated as the first, but prior to that, I found that there's one of the missionary instructors, I guess, at Lahaina Luna is writing back to New England saying, hey, you need to send us more money because the Kanaka who are working at the printing press are refusing to work because they don't get paid enough. And if we understand Lahaina Luna as essentially the first college, that means the first strike was actually Hawaiian student workers.
Right.
Who are just saying no. So
and that would be like Malo, right?
Yeah, that would be like Malo.
Right.
And so this labor consciousness is developing simultaneous with, you know, the influx of capitalist forms of labor.
And that is so different from most of us. Even, you know, I have a couple of college degrees too. And, you know, the tendency is to think that labor movements are from foreign immigrants.
Right.
You know, that, you know, those ones that we've heard of and or the ones that we're more familiar with all the way up until today, right? When striking happens and when organizing happens, that it's not Native Hawaiians.
Right.
It's the non-Hawaiians who are doing that. But, you know, thank you for that.
Yeah.
You know, thank you for that history and that overview there.
Yeah.
And so what was the role of Native Hawaiians in unionizing?
Okay, then it gets even better.
Did I leap too far?
No,
Is that too far
not
of a jump?
Not at all. I mean, we see just to go a little bit before that, we see a lot of critique from Hawaiians who we know and love, such as Johnny Bush, who was a member of Hui Aloha Hui Kalai'aina. He was a diplomat for Kalakaua, and he was the editor for Kaleo Kalahui. Major critiques in that newspaper coming out of that newspaper about labor exploitation of immigrants on the plantations. So much so that the, sugar-controlled newspapers started accusing Kaleo Kalahui of being socialists. And Kaleo Kalahui retorts that so beautifully, and they lay out this whole analysis of socialism. So it shows that they were actually studying these other forms of political economy that were a counter to capitalism.
I want the link to what he wrote.
Yeah, right. I'll send it. And it's actually in the English column in Kaleo Kalahui.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so anyways, there's just all this stuff happening in the late 1800s. And then the overthrow, of course, is what facilitates the intensification of exploited labor. So that's why we see the rise of a labor movement in territorial Hawaii. And this is because, one, now the sugar barons, the sugar class, have full access to land, right? They seize Hawaiian lands and the sugar plantations expand a lot. But it's not just the sugar plantations, it's all the industries around them too.
Right.
So you see Kanaka they're actually the dock workers. Kanaka are the dock workers. They may not be the highest ethnicity on the plantations, but they are in the docks. And that transports the sugar.
Right.
And they are being treated just as horribly and dangerously as people on the plantation. So all of this starts to come together with some mentoring from people abroad. And a man named Harry Kamoku, who's from Hilo, he's a dock worker. He goes and participates in the 1934 dock strike in San Francisco, and a bunch of other Hawaiians. And Gerald Horne writes about how the Hawaiians in that strike were known for beating up scabs, which are people who cross the picket line, right? Came back and was instrumental in the formation of ILWU Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So Native Hawaiian was
totally led, totally recognized as like the primary leader of that time.
And the ILW also did a lot of primary organizing on the plantations themselves.
And the plantations, right. So this was the first time that the organizing for labor, it doesn't become specific to ethnicity on the plantations. The ethnicities start to organize together. It used to be where everybody was
Right.
kept separate, right?
Right.
And that's a boss tactic. That's an employer class tactic.
Right.
And then it's also we see the industries starting to be like, oh, wait, the sugar gets produced and harvested here. It's got to go to the warehouses. It's got to go to the boats. It's got to go through the trains. And all of the workers in those industries start organizing. And when you look at the 1930s, you see the most militant resistance to the oligarchy at that time, to those who overthrew our country. And I think it's even unmatched to today.
Wow. Wow. You know, and that intense period of the 1930s, so what's going on in the world at that time, right, is there's this war happening, right? There's these wars that are happening on other continents, right, spurring other industries and so forth. And Hawaii is kind of sitting here in the middle of this economic boom for the oligarchy, right, in sugar, in pineapple, you know, and all those kind of raw goods here. Does the military at all have an intersection? I know it's not one of the questions, but just one of the things that you talked about, I was wondering if there's a nexus between military movements and what's going on in the rest of the world.
Isn't the military the reason for all this?
Well, actually, no. I highly recommend the book Fighting in Paradise by renowned scholar Gerald Horne. It's so good. It's one of my favorite books on Hawaii history. And he talks about how just when the industries, right, so the dock workers and sugar and all these guys really start rising up and really gaining power and becoming a major threat to the powers that be, then World War II hits. And now national security is used as the justification. So we know about Japanese internment camps, right? But do we know that that was used to actually take out Japanese labor leaders?
Wow.
So the rise of war became the justification for the suppression of organized labor, and it did take a big hit at that time. And probably was never quite the same, but still rose to seize political power in Hawaii.
But even if we were to back up a few decades, right? You have the idea that Hawaii would be the coaling station in order to move U.S. military forces
across,
from the continent through Hawaii to the Philippines, and it's all about, you know, dominating all of these major places of frankly cheap labor and cheap land. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
You know, Ikaika, if we was to jump to now, right, and we'll get back to the then and try and merge timelines here. You know, Hawaii has one of the largest participations, right, percentage-wise, in unions, right? Is that true? Is that about true across the United States?
There was an article by Chad Blair the other day which said this. Yes.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that here we are again? You know. We supposedly only have, you know, 2 industries on the island, you know, throughout our islands.
I didn't know there was that many.
Right. Or one, right. And yet we have the highest participation in, you know, in unions and in organized labor across. Why do you think that is?
I think, first of all, the unions are doing a good job of organizing. You know, the unions are strong, which is a really important thing, and it's a good thing. But secondly, if you look at kind of our history, right, it's about our country being taken over for capitalist interests, you know, supported by the U.S. military. And so there's all these folks who are experiencing this, you know, this the domination and the exploitation by capitalist interests, their bosses, and so what do? They organize. They organize themselves, and that's the thing about being in a union is that, you know, as regular citizens, we often have a difficult time imagining how we can take control of our lives. Right? It's kind of the junk thing about being a person in this modern era, but one of the few places that we can have some control is as workers in a union, you know, within a workplace. And that's one clear way in which people can improve their lives.
Right.
Like they can actually make their lives substantially better. The wages for a unionized hotel worker is easy, $10 more an hour than a non-unionized worker.
I didn't realize that
Yeah,
there was such a huge jump.
It's like you become a person with a living wage
right.
through the existence of unions, and you don't get that. You know, if you're like, for instance, a non-unionized fast food worker or a non-unionized Starbucks worker.
Right.
That's why what's happening right now with Starbucks all across the United States is so awesome. And we need to do that. We need to look at like the new warehouses, the Amazons of the world, and figure out.
Amazon is coming,
Yeah.
and Amazon is also organizing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, their workers are organizing across, across their platforms. And if we look at organized labor and in unions and just what you were talking about, basically just the organizing of people for the betterment, for the more like the well-being of their families, themselves, their families, and their communities, right? I'm gonna take a leap here and ask. We just had an election. We just had a primary election.
That's right. That's what I was doing the whole time.
Yeah. We were I was asking Ikaika earlier. I was like, Ikaika, what do you do nowadays, right? Because Ikaika's known to do.
I'm recovering.
Things. Yeah, right. He's a recovering employee of many things, but elections is also something that the unions. Okay, so I'm gonna take this a couple of different ways, just because we have another elections coming up, here. But to understand kind of the role of unions, how unions play in elections, and how that organized efforts transfer into political power. Yeah. What are Hawaiians' roles in those spaces too? Because there's whether it's a fact or a myth, we still haven't been able to crack the code yet to see, do Hawaiians vote or do they not vote, right? That's a question that, a lot of us will ask ourselves every time we see an election happen, right? And I know I'm going all over the place with that, but basically voting and unions and the kind of organizing that happens for, making these determinations kind of based on what you just said too, with that well-being.
So let me answer it in a way that I didn't think I was going to answer it when we were thinking about this podcast, but I would say a union is an army, and what makes an army powerful is that it has a single will. It works together. It has a strategy that it executes on the shop floor, generally, in relationship with the boss, and the owners, the transnational corporations which actually own Hawaii, right? The unions often are fighting those forces.
Those influences.
Yeah, at least in the private sector unions. It's obviously very different for teachers.
Right.
But, the problem that we have in our community, I think, is that once we get out of the shop floor and into the neighborhoods, then we start to think, okay, well, my interest is me, my family, my kids, my property taxes. It's, how much I don't like my neighbor. It's my fence, it's my, and it's all these things where we start to think of ourselves as individuals. And I understand that, but I think what we need to rekindle in our communities is a sense of solidarity, the sense that we're actually in it together, that we have shared interests, and the more we can nurture that feeling, I think we're going to do a better job of doing things like voting. Like I think of voting as like the smallest possible participation in society. You mean
like the smallest or the most basic, like most fundamental?
Yeah, I don't want to.
Not even that.
I don't want to denigrate it. It's a good starting point, and I think it's a great way.
It's a great way of putting it.
In union organizing, we have this thing we call a structure test. It's a way we figure out how strong we actually are, because when you do something as scary as running a strike, you need to have something like 80% or 90% of your friends, your co-workers with you.
Right.
Because otherwise, the strike will collapse, and we will lose. We will lose our dreams of owning a home, of having health care for our families.
Right.
All of these really basic things. So you have to have an incredibly strong structure. And the way you test it is you find little things along the way to say, how many people will sign a petition? Will I be able to get my whole department to sign a petition?
Right.
If 8 out of 10 people sign the petition, then you've hit your structure test. Will
Right.
66% of this table vote
Right.
for something? And voting is a great way of testing our structure. What I find in our Hawaiian community is that we don't have structure. That's our problem. We think of ourselves as individual voters, and so we get to choose Republican or Democrat or, Iona or Green. But we actually have to think about, okay, what is our collective interest?
Right.
I wanna
And
answer
who
that
best
too.
represents that?
Yeah.
Another way we sort of separate ourselves once we leave work is as Hawaiians. So we think our work and our union, if we belong to a union,
Right.
issues are one thing. Like, how do I feel at work? How am I treated at work? What are my wages and things like that? Then when we
Right.
leave work, then we put on our kukia imana shirts and we
Right.
think that our Hawaiian selves are something else. But unionism at its strongest does not separate any aspect of the worker. And so another way to sort of lean into power because unions do have influence on elections. Unfortunately, I'll say, I think it's a terrible influence. It doesn't
I was going to
use
throw that out there,
power.
but I'm glad you said it and not me.
I mean, it doesn't use its power in a way
Right.
that actually is always in, to benefit the workers, definitely not Hawaiians. But that's also partly because unionism has shifted and we need to shift it back to a place where all of our interests, we lean into the union to carry
Right.
those interests. And we see how that happened at the LA teachers strike a couple years ago, where they got everything from pay increases and class size, limits to setting up a fund for families to defend themselves against ICE agents and immigration policies. So they really took all of their social justice issues and interests that is who they actually are as teachers and students and parents, and they brought it all into the union, and they made these huge political gains
Right.
through their contract fight and their strike. They won these things in negotiations.
I had friends who were involved in that, teachers in the LA, SUD?
USD.
Or USD district up there, and I was watching it because it was being chronicled, right? Day by day, the teachers were speaking about it and posting about it and so forth. Thank you for, because I didn't know exactly kind of what happened at the end. I just know that they were happy at the end of it. It was like a finally, and we're good now. We're going to go back to work. But it's good to know, some of those details. So how do you guys think that can happen? How do we, inspire the unions to go back to those, bringing, I guess it's almost like family values back into the union structure, and not just or not bifurcating people, right? Like where the person is, when they participate in the union, this is the expectation, we're speaking about, fringe benefits, we're speaking about healthcare, we're speaking about that, and actually infusing, again, some of that, more kind of global solidarity, right?
So that is the $1 million question, because it is a huge potential, right? What organized labor has is leverage, right? And so where do we, in the Hawaiian community, where do we find our leverage? We have different ways of leverage, but one of them can be if we don't separate those two things, right? So it's going to take some re-education, honestly, because some unions don't teach the rank and file that they are the union. They sort of message that union
We are
leadership
the
is the
right,
union, and you
right.
can come to us if you got a problem, and we'll see you at negotiations.
Right.
But that's a particular model. And another model is that member-driven, organized-driven unionism. But we kind of have to do some education in our community. And once people understand that, then they see that all of the ways to be involved and saturate the structure of a union, we can do that.
That's
and
awesome.
That builds, it not only builds like political power within the system, it builds the ability to call for different things every 4 years when you go into negotiations with strike power behind you.
Right, with that leverage. But now we're going to get into a question that I personally witnessed, right? And it's that kind of conflict or the complexity when it comes to Native Hawaiian movements and around protection of spaces and so forth. And when it runs right up against unions, right, and the work and the labor that goes into development mostly, right, in those cases, right? Can you guys share a little bit about and talk a little bit about your thoughts on that complexity? And
I would just say, one kind of quick thought is not all unions are the same, right? Some unions are pro-capital, meaning that they're pro the boss, and some unions are pro-labor. In other words, they're pro-working class people. And
that's a great distinction. I've never heard that before.
And it's unfortunately true, right? And if you have to kind of look at the business models of unions. Like some unions are structured very differently, and they have like partnerships between working class, like the actual labor organization itself, and the boss. And so sometimes their interests get kind of messy.
Right.
And I think that's part of what we're seeing in things like TMT, for instance, where there's some unions which are on what I think is the right side of the issue, being against the construction of the telescope, and there's some unions which have a much more ambivalent position on it. And it's because their interests are mixed up.
That's a very nice way of saying that, by the way.
Hey, I can say things without saying things.
Yeah. No, that's good. And, you two are Native Hawaiians, actively, both researching and working in, organized, unions and so forth. What could be the role? And I'm going to let you, ʻIlima, answer the first question too, but I want to get this one out there, so maybe you can answer both and you can jump in on the second one. But what is the role of Native Hawaiians in kind of bridging that gap between labor unions and Native Hawaiian movements?
Well, first of all, that was such a great answer, Ikaika. This is why I love for you to go first, because you help us know how to think about it, how to look at the question even, right? Like, give us a framework. Okay, now we have a framework. So, and this is actually one of the reasons for the divide that we talked about earlier, is that we often see unions as the sort of lobbyists for development of our aina, and it's super problematic. And it goes, it's supported by that narrative of jobs. Like jobs is the bottom line for everything, and that in order to have jobs, we have to sacrifice all of our love for our aina and all of our morals and any sense of environmental protection because jobs, right? That's a myth. It's a myth to keep us, just supporting that class, the developers and things like that. So we have to do work to actively counter that narrative. And I think developing also, because unions have a lot of education programs as part of them, but developing union history, labor history into those aren't always a part of the programs. And if the unions, say the pro boss unions, don't develop that, then we need to be providing that elsewhere, so that and not just Kanaka, but everybody who loves this place, really loves and wants to protect this place, needs to take over the unions. And jobs are important, living wages are important, healthcare is important, and all of those things are as equally as important as taking care of our aina.
Right.
Making
Fresh
sure
water
our
is important. Right.
These are all worker issues too, right? Especially for us. So some of the work that I'm doing, outside of school and outside of my 9 to 5, which is at HSTA, some of the work that I'm doing is to help develop political history curriculum for certain unions that we're working with, and just really trying to think about the strategies of how to bring these two really powerful forces together for the protection of our lahui and our aina. Yeah.
Right.
I want to dive deep, go a little deeper on some of the things you're talking about, which is to say that unions, I believe, are like the most important force for the working class, and at their best, unions are the democratic. They're democratic organizations, right? They're controlled by the members. They elect their leaders, and at their best, they express the desires of values of working people, right? Which is all the things that ʻIlima just mentioned. And so the thing, though, that I think we need to watch out for is that this is an unfortunate truth, which is that not all Hawaiians are going to be good leaders. However, I do believe that any person can become a good leader.
Right.
Like you can work with every single person, even the most difficult folks in our community. I think with the right leadership from other people, from people who love them and want them to grow as an individual, as a leader in their own right, I think there's always a way of sitting down with someone and having a one-on-one conversation and saying, you know what, your position on TMT, let's talk about it. You know, let's talk about your position on Red Hill.
Right.
Let's talk about your thinking about, I don't know, whatever, housing, whatever the thing is. And good unions actually facilitate that kind of conversation because they're about identifying each person, each housekeeper, each janitor, each teacher as being like someone who is not just a pencil pusher for the boss, but they themselves are the fuel for revolution.
Right.
That's the person who's going to change the world for everybody.
Right.
And so if you start seeing each person as having that potential, then I think the way that we would do our politics is really different. It's like, you know, actually this one guy over here, they're really special. They can bring their whole family. They can bring their whole department because they're a good leader. They care. They're willing to take a stand. They're willing to act out of courage, you know,
and not fear.
Not fear, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so, I mean, I actually have a lot of hope, and it's because I've gotten to see what it's like. And I'm not a union guy from before. Like, I joined Local 5 because I would be organizing stuff in our Hawaiian community, and I would see Local 5 show up, and they would show up in numbers for us.
With energy.
With energy. It's like, wow, who are these guys with their red shirts?
Right.
And, you know, it just so happened I was thankful to lose my last election in 2018. So I asked the folks at Local 5 if I could come work for them because I heard that they were going into a major strike against Marriott, which is the largest hotel company on earth.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, you know what? It's always good to have a good opponent, right? A good enemy, someone that makes you feel like it's a David Goliath kind of fight.
Right.
The housekeeper against the CEO of Marriott, who in a day, the CEO makes what a housekeeper makes in a full year.
Right.
I thought, okay, this is a good fight. I want to see what it's like. And so I got to see it. I saw like real solidarity. People, you know, like I can't remember, but in the final day of negotiations in that Kioia Marriott strike, there was one group of workers who were willing to take a lower benefit because they wanted to support another group of workers. I'm like, you never see that in the neighborhoods, right? People willing to say, "Oh, give me less."
Right.
That's amazing.
Right. The humanity that shows up.
Right. So
when it needs to.
made me a believer.
And I mean, I 100% agree. Working inside a union, I mean, I see all of these things, the structure of it, the particular one that I work for, which is HSTA, it's structured to be able to develop leadership, to develop structure, as Ikaika talked about earlier. But what unions do that other sort of maybe structured ways that we organize ourselves don't do is they're always focused on the betterment of the people and building power to get that, right?
Right.
And so I think that also in our Hawaiian movement, we can be informed by some of these things. You know, so how are we building structure? How are we building structure in our movement? And how are we building strategy within those structures to really build power?
Right.
So we're really good at mobilizing, right? We see some kupuna get arrested on the Mauna, and we will show up in the tens of thousands in a day, and it's awesome.
Right.
But do we have a structure to fall into
that
really keeps us organized, has continuous education happening within that structure, and is strategizing to operate as a one, right? To take us out of that individual sort of mindset when it comes to politics and things like that, and where we operate as one force.
You know, you guys have given me so much hope today. It's been a while since I've been outside of a union system, since I left UH. You know, I haven't been involved too much, even just in the daily happenings of a union discussion. But this has been incredibly enlightening. And I love, Ikaika, I love the Zen mode that you always are in, to be able to bring about some clarity to the kind of, it can get very smoke and mirrors at times when we're watching battles happen between labor and these huge companies, right? Sometimes it can get lost. We can get lost in all the messaging, right? So thank you for bringing clarity. And, you know, ʻIlima, always thank you for bringing context, you know, some historical context to help us understand what we're seeing, what we're watching in front of us, right? But both of you have, you know, not only given me, I know they've given you guys hope out there too about the role of the unions. And if you guys are out there and you guys are part of unions, go and demand some leadership, right? Participate, you know, at that level. Take advantage of all these things. I didn't realize there was such a wellspring of things that could be garnered, you know, from being a union. All the years I was at UH in a union, I never participated, you know, in any of the, you know, any of the hierarchies. But I'm realizing now that was a missed opportunity, right? That was a missed space, you know, to learn. And I forgive you, because I think you were working for me, and then you went to go work for the Local 5 after that. But since you did amazing work, you know, over there, I'm not hurt now that you know, you left me to go over there and work. But yeah, thank you guys for joining us here. Again, this is Midday Manaʻo with Mehana and Manu, here every Friday at Avakea, right? Kaukalolo, Iluna, o mako ne. Me ke aloha ya mako ya oko pakahi e kalahui e ahui ho kako aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha.